Have you ever wondered what really makes something a crime? I mean, beyond just being a bad act. Today, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of it. We're not just going to define what a felony is, we're going to build one, from the ground up, piece by piece. We'll start with the architect's blueprint, the initial thought. Then we'll lay the foundation, which is the physical act. We'll even see what happens when the whole construction project goes completely sideways. By the end of this, you're going to see the complete anatomy of a crime.
So, here's our game plan. Our architectural briefing, if you will. First, we'll look at the fundamental blueprint of what a felony even is. Then, we're diving deep into the mind of the person committing it. After that, we'll track the whole journey from a simple plan to a completed action. We'll look at what happens when intent misfires, and trust me, it gets weird. We'll connect the crime to its consequence, and then finally, we'll classify the finished structure of the crime.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the blueprint of a felony. Before we can build anything, we have to understand the basic design principles, right? We need to know the legal definition that actually separates just a wrongful act from a criminal one.
Now, on the surface, this definition looks almost too simple, but there's a really critical duality hidden in there. A felony can be an act, a physical movement, something you actually do, like throwing a punch or grabbing a wallet. But it can also be an omission. That's a failure to do something you're legally required to do, something you didn't do. Think about a lifeguard who sees someone drowning and just decides not to act, or a public official who knows about a crime and fails to report it. So you see, the law punishes not just doing bad things, but also doing nothing when you have a duty to act.
Every single felony has to be built on these three structural pillars. If one is missing, the whole thing falls apart. First, you need that act or omission we just talked about. Second, it can't just be something we think is morally wrong. It has to be specifically written down and made punishable by the law, in this case, the revised penal code. That's a huge principle. No crime if there's no law against it. And third, and this is really the core of what we're talking about today, the act has to be driven by either dolo, which is just a fancy word for deliberate intent, or culpa, which is fault through negligence. You need all three of these pillars, or legally speaking, there is no crime.
Let's think about these two mindsets, dolo and culpa, as two completely different kinds of architects. The architect of dolo designs with pure malice. Their blueprint is drawn up with a specific goal of causing harm. Every line, every measurement on that plan is aimed at destruction. On the other hand, the architect of culpa is just dangerously careless. They don't mean for the building to collapse, but their wrongful act, maybe they used cheap materials or they just ignored safety codes, it comes from negligence or a shocking lack of skill. One is a villain, the other is a fool. But you know what? Both of them can create a structure of harm that the law has to deal with. And that leads us perfectly into Section 2, the mind of the offender. Now that we get the two basic mindsets, dolo and culpa, let's dig into the official legal terms for the physical act versus the mental state. This is all about separating the blueprint from the actual foundation. So first up, we've got actus reus. It's Latin for the guilty act. This is the objective, physical part of the crime. It's the foundation being laid. It's the concrete thing you can see and observe. It's the punch being thrown, the wallet being taken, the report not being filed. The law looks at the actus reus to figure out what happened, completely separate from whatever the person was thinking at the time.
And here's its partner in crime, literally, mens rea, the guilty mind. This is the subjective part, the internal blueprint. What was the architect's plan? This is the intent, the knowledge, the recklessness, or the negligence that was the engine behind the physical act. Mens rea is what separates a tragic accident from a deliberate murder, or a simple mistake from a malicious con job.
So let's boil it down. Actus reus is what you did. Mens rea is why you did it. To build a proper intentional felony, you absolutely need both. I mean, a guilty mind with no action is just a dark fantasy. And a harmful act with no guilty mind is, well, it's just an accident. Think of it like a loaded gun. The gun itself just sitting there, that's the actus reus. The decision to aim it and pull the trigger, that's the mens rea. The foundation needs a blueprint, and the blueprint is useless without a foundation.
But that kind of gets you thinking, doesn't it? If mens rea is this guilty mind, are all guilty minds treated the same way? Is all intent really created equal in the eyes of the law? Well, the answer, and this probably won't surprise you, is a definite no.
You see, the law gets even more specific. It breaks down intent into general and specific.
General intent is pretty much assumed from the act itself. If you intentionally punch someone in the face, the law just assumes you intended the act of punching. The prosecutor doesn't have to prove you were aiming for the left nostril. But some crimes have a much higher bar. They require specific intent. This means there's an additional mental goal. Look at robbery. It's not enough to prove you took someone's property. The prosecution has to prove you took it with the specific intent to gain from it. This just shows how the law sometimes needs to see not just the blueprint for the action itself, but the blueprint for the ultimate goal.
Okay, so we've got our blueprint, mens rea, and we've got our foundation, actus reus. So now for Section 3, let's actually watch the construction process. Let's see the journey from a simple idea to a fully finished crime.
A crime doesn't just pop into existence. It follows a path, a timeline. It usually starts with what we call preparatory acts. Buying a weapon, scouting a location. Most of the time, the law doesn't punish these acts because, hey, you can still change your mind. But then you get to this crucial line in the sand, the overt act. This is the moment you start the direct execution, picking the lock, aiming the gun. Once you cross that line, you're in punishable territory, and you start moving through the attempted, then frustrated, and maybe finally the consummated stages of the crime.
To see how all this theory plays out in the messy real world, let's look at the absolutely tragic case of People versus Puget. The facts are just brutal. As part of what they called fun-making, one guy, Puget, douses a victim with gasoline. A little later, a second guy, Samson, shows up and sets the victim on fire. So you have two people, one horrific outcome. But the question for the court is, did they have the same criminal mind? Were they working off the same blueprint?
The court decided they did not. There was no conspiracy, no shared blueprint. They judged each man based on his own individual act and mindset. Puget, the one who poured the gasoline as a joke, was the architect of culpa. He acted with a catastrophic level of reckless imprudence. Samson, on the other hand, who deliberately lit the match, he was the architect of dolo. He acted with deliberate, malicious intent. It's the same tragic result, but two totally different crimes born from two vastly different mental states.
This case leads us perfectly into Section 4, when intent goes awry. What happens when the architect's plan just doesn't match the final building? Let's take a look at what I like to call the construction site accidents of the criminal world. All the mistakes, miscalculations, and just plain impossible plans.
The law actually has specific names for these kinds of screw-ups. First, there's aberratio ictus, which means mistake in the blow. Just think of this as bad aim. An assassin intends to shoot person A, but his hand shakes and the bullet hits person B standing next to them. The intent to kill was there, but the execution was just sloppy. Then you have error in personae, or mistaken identity. This is more like bad information. The hitman goes to the right place, executes his plan perfectly, only to find out he killed the wrong person because he was given the wrong description. In both of these scenarios, the guilty mind is still there, and the law absolutely steps in.
And there's a third type of miscalculation called praeter intentionnum, which basically means beyond the intention. This is when the consequence is way, way worse than you ever planned. You get in a fight, you shove someone, only meaning to push them away. But they trip, fall backward, hit their head on the pavement, and die. Your blueprint was for a minor injury, but the result was a fatality. Now, this doesn't get you off the hook, but the law might see it as a mitigating circumstance, because the full horrific result wasn't actually part of your malicious plan.
All right, now for a real head-scratcher. What if your plan was just doomed from the very beginning? Can you actually be punished for a crime that was physically impossible to complete? Like, what if you try to poison someone with what you think is a deadly chemical, but it turns out to be just regular table sugar?
And the answer is a huge, resounding yes. The law calls this an impossible crime, and the reason behind it is so important. The law isn't punishing the outcome here because, no harm was actually done. It's punishing the mindset. By trying to poison someone, even with sugar, you've shown the world that you have a dangerous criminal tendency. Think of the law like a virus scanner for society. It doesn't just clean up after a successful attack, it tries to find and quarantine malicious code, that dangerous blueprint in your mind, before it ever finds a way to cause real damage.
This brings us to Section 5, crime and causation. See, it's not enough for the prosecution to just show there was an act, and then later there was a harmful result. They have to build a bridge between the two, a clear, unbroken line that connects the action directly to that final outcome.
That bridge has a name, proximate cause. The easiest way to think about it is like the first domino that you push, setting off a whole chain reaction. For the crime to stick, the end result has to be a natural, foreseeable consequence of that first push.
If you blow through a red light and cause a crash, your action is the proximate cause of the injuries. But let's say the person is on the way to the hospital and the ambulance gets hit by a meteor. Well, that meteor is a new, intervening cause that breaks the chain of your responsibility.
And that brings us to our last stop, Section 6, classifying the final crime. We've designed the blueprint, we've laid the foundation, we've watched the construction from start to finish. Now it's time for the final inspection. We have to classify the finished building according to the law and figure out just how serious it is.
So, from the very first blueprint of intent to the final and sometimes tragic structure of a completed crime, we've really taken apart the anatomy of a felony. We've seen that the law doesn't just care about what you did, it is profoundly concerned with why you did it, what you intended, and what unforeseen consequences came out of it. And that leaves us with one last big thought. Now that we've built this crime, how does the law measure its weight? And maybe more importantly, what happens when applying this very intricate legal architecture leads to a penalty that just feels wrong or unjust? That's the moment where the structure of law has to face the much bigger concept of justice itself.